The mountains do not care about your experience, or your gear, or the fact that you have people waiting for you back at the trailhead. In the state of Montana, there is a range called the Crazy Mountains, and the name is not a marketing gimmick or a bit of local flavor. It is a warning etched into the jagged limestone and the dark timber that clings to the slopes like a dying man to a life raft. People go into those woods, and the woods decide if they come back, or if they become part of the heavy silence that sits in the valleys. I have spent years looking at maps and reading the statements of men who have seen things they cannot explain. The story of Aaron Hedges is one of those cases that sits in the back of your mind like a splinter you cannot reach. It is a narrative of a man who should have been fine but ended up scattered across a landscape that defied every logic of survival. In September of 2014, the air in the Crazies was already turning sharp with the promise of an early winter. Aaron Hedges was 38 years old, and he was not some city dweller looking for a weekend thrill. He was a hunter and a woodsman who knew the weight of a pack and the way a trail can disappear under a dusting of snow. He set out with 2 friends for a week of bow hunting for elk. They had a plan, and they had supplies, and they had the kind of confidence that comes from doing the same thing a dozen times before. But the mountains have a way of shifting when you are not looking. On the 7th day of September, Aaron decided to push on to a different camp while his companions stayed behind. He was looking for a cache of supplies they had dropped off earlier. It was a simple trek of a few miles. He never made it to the cache. The silence that followed his disappearance was not immediate, but it was absolute. When a man does not show up at a designated spot in the wilderness, you give him a few hours for a turned ankle or a bad map reading. Then you give him a night because maybe he hunkered down to wait out the dark. But by the time the sun crawled over the peaks on the 2nd day, the dread began to set in like a deep frost. The search and rescue teams that descended on the Crazy Mountains were some of the best in the country. They brought in dogs and helicopters with thermal imaging and men who could track a mountain lion across bare rock. They looked in the drawers, and the coulées, and the dense stands of lodgepole pine. They found nothing. No blood and no torn fabric, and no footprints in the soft mud near the creek beds. It was as if Aaron Hedges had simply stepped off the face of the earth. If you have ever been in a true wilderness, you know the feeling of the Oz effect. It is that moment when the birds stop singing and the wind dies down and the world feels like it is made of static. You feel a pressure on your chest, and the hairs on your neck stand up because you realize you are no longer the apex predator in the woods. Investigators found it strange that Aaron had deviated so wildly from his intended path. He was heading for a cache to the north, but the few clues they eventually found suggested he was moving in a direction that made no sense. He was climbing toward the high ridges when any survival manual tells you to follow the water down to the valley floor. It was as if something was pulling him upward into the thin air, where the oxygen is scarce and the mind begins to fracture. 1 year after he vanished, a rancher on the eastern side of the mountains found something that should not have been there. It was a pair of boots and a water bladder. They were miles away from where Aaron was last seen, and they were located on a steep scree slope that would be difficult for a healthy man to navigate in broad daylight. The boots were not scattered by scavengers. They were sitting there as if they had been taken off and placed down with intention. This is a recurring theme in these cases that keeps me awake at night. Men who are freezing to death often suffer from paradoxical undressing, where they feel a sudden burst of heat and strip off their clothes. But Aaron Hedges was a seasoned hunter. He knew the signs of hypothermia. And the boots were found in a place that required him to cross a mountain pass that was choked with snow and jagged rock. The physical exertion required to reach that spot is something the investigators struggled to wrap their heads around. To get from his last known position to the place where his boots were found, Aaron would have had to traverse miles of the most vertical and unforgiving terrain in the range. He would have had to do this in the middle of a storm that dropped temperatures into the teens. He was carrying a heavy pack and wearing hunting gear. And yet he moved with a speed and a directness that defied his physical condition. It is as if the laws of friction and fatigue did not apply to him during those final hours. When you look at the topographical maps, the route looks like a jagged line of impossible climbs and descents. It is a path a ghost might take, but not a man made of flesh and bone. In 2016, the final pieces of the puzzle were found by another rancher even further down the mountain. They found Aaron's remains along with his bow and his backpack. He was miles away from the boots. He was in an area that had been searched by air multiple times. The remains were found in a spot that was relatively open, but the searchers had missed him for 2 years. His clothes were gone or scattered, and his equipment was lying in the dirt like relics of a forgotten civilization. The autopsy could not determine a cause of death because the elements and the animals had been at him for too long. But the mystery was not in how he died, but in how he got there. He had traveled over 15 miles through the heart of the crazies, a distance that would have challenged a professional athlete in perfect weather. There is a theory that the mountains themselves have pockets of space where time and distance do not behave. Some call it a portal, and some call it a magnetic anomaly, but the people who live in the shadows of the crazies just call it the mountains. They tell stories of lights in the sky, and figures that move through the trees with a fluidity that no human can match. When Aaron Hedges went missing, the weather turned foul almost instantly. This is another pattern we see. The sky closes up and the wind howls and the tracks are wiped clean before the search can even begin. It is as if the environment is conspiring to hide the evidence of what is happening under the canopy. You can call it bad luck if you want, but after you see it 100 times, you start to call it a signature. The discovery of his gear in separate locations suggests a long and agonizing journey. Why would a man leave his boots on a high ridge and then continue to walk for miles over sharp stones and frozen ground? His feet would have been shredded within an hour. Yet there he was, moving across the landscape like a shadow. There are those who suggest that something was chasing him, or perhaps something was leading him. In many of these missing person cases, the victims are found in areas that have already been searched, or in places that seem physically impossible to reach. Aaron Hedges ended up on the wrong side of a mountain range, in a place he had no reason to be. He was a hunter who became the hunted, and he didn't even know what was on his trail. Think about the sheer silence of those high peaks. When the sun goes down, the temperature drops 40 degrees in the blink of an eye. You are alone, and your mind starts to play tricks on you. You hear a branch snap behind you and you turn, but there is nothing there. You see a shape out of the corner of your eye, and when you look it is just a stump. But for Aaron Hedges, the shapes were real enough. Something drove him to climb when he should have descended. Something made him take off his boots and walk until his heart stopped. We like to think we are the masters of the wild, because we have GPS units and Gore-Tex jackets, but the wild is older than our species, and it has its own set of rules. The investigators looked into his background, searching for a reason for him to disappear. Was he depressed? Was he trying to start a new life? The answer was always no. He was a happy man with a family and a passion for the outdoors. There was no suicide note and no hidden debt. There was only a man who went into the woods and encountered something that stripped him of his logic and then his life. The case was closed and the remains were buried, but the questions remain hanging in the air like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Every time a hunter goes into the crazies, they think about Aaron. They look over their shoulders and they check their maps twice, and they try not to listen to the wind when it starts to sound like a human voice. I have seen the photos of the area where he was found. It is beautiful in a way that feels aggressive. The rock is sharp, and the trees are twisted by the constant battering of the elements. It is not a place for humans. We are just visitors there, and sometimes the mountains decide to keep their guests. The physical impossibility of Aaron's final trek is the part that grinds at me. A man without boots cannot walk miles through Montana, scree, and timber. It is a biological certainty. And yet he did. Or something moved him. Or the world he was walking in wasn't the same world we are standing in now. We want to believe in a rational universe where everything has a cause and an effect, but the missing 411 files are a testament to the fact that we are living on the edge of a great unknown. The pattern is there if you are willing to look. High elevation, and granite rocks, and moving water, and a sudden change in weather. These are the ingredients for a disappearance. Aaron Hedges checked every box. He was in the prime of his life and he was equipped for the environment, and yet he was erased. The boots sitting on the ridge are the most haunting detail for me. It is a gesture of surrender. It is the moment he stopped being a hunter and became a part of the mountain. The rancher who found them said the hair on his arms stood up when he saw them. He knew instinctively that he was looking at the remains of a tragedy that didn't make sense. We spend our lives trying to build walls between ourselves and the darkness. We have our lights and our heaters and our locked doors. But when you step into the crazy mountains, those walls vanish. You are back in the food chain and you are not at the top. Aaron Hedges found that out in the most brutal way possible. He spent his final hours wandering a landscape that had turned alien to him. He was cold and he was tired and he was lost in a way that goes beyond geography. He was lost in the very fabric of the world. And when they finally found him, there was nothing left to tell the story but a few bones and a bow that would never be drawn again. The tragedy of Aaron Hedges is not just that he died, but that he died in a way that mocks our understanding of survival. We tell ourselves that if we do everything right, we will be safe. We buy the best boots, and we study the maps, and we stay with our friends. But Aaron shows us that sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. Sometimes the mountain wants you and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The wind in the crazies continues to blow, and the snow continues to fall, and the secrets of what happened to Aaron Hedges are buried under layers of limestone and time. We are left with the maps and the reports and the cold feeling in our guts that we are being watched from the tree line. This is the reality of the wilderness. It is not a park, and it is not a playground. It is a vast and hungry entity that does not recognize our laws. Aaron Hedges was a man of the woods, and the woods took him back. He traveled 15 miles through a nightmare and ended up as a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks they have the mountains figured out. The boots are still out there in a box somewhere, and the backpack is a piece of evidence in a file that will never truly be closed. Because how do you close a file on the impossible? How do you explain a man who walked through fire and ice without his shoes? You can't. You just document it and you wait for the next one. The silence in the crazy mountains is heavy, and it is growing. Every year people go in, and every year some don't come out. We look for patterns and we look for clues, but the truth is always just out of reach. We are like children trying to understand the ocean by looking at a cup of salt water. Aaron Hedges is gone, and he took the truth with him into the dark. All we have are the fragments of a journey that should not have happened. A journey that defied physics and broken the heart of a family. The mountains are still there, and they are still waiting. And they are still crazy. The case of Aaron Hedges is hauntingly similar to the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Jared was only 3 years old when he vanished from a trail right in front of a group of adults. Like Aaron, his remains were found years later at a much higher elevation in a spot that seemed impossible for a small child to reach on his own. His clothing was found in a similar state of being oddly placed, and his skull showed signs of a strange trauma that didn't fit a simple fall or a predator attack. Both cases involve the high country and the granite peaks, and a timeline that stretches across years before a gruesome discovery is made. They are both threads in a larger cloth that we are still trying to unweave. There is also the case of Keith Parkins, who disappeared in the Rincon Mountains of Arizona. He was only 2 years old and he vanished from his grandfather's ranch. He was found 19 hours later and 20 miles away on the other side of a mountain range. He had traveled across some of the most rugged terrain in the desert in a time frame that would be impossible for an adult to manage on foot. He was found alive, but he couldn't explain how he had moved so far and so fast. These stories are not just anomalies. They are a pattern of high-speed movement across impossible terrain that suggests a force we do not yet understand. Aaron Hedges was just one man in a long list of people who have been taken by the mountains and returned in pieces. When you go into the woods next time, I want you to remember Aaron. I want you to look at your boots and think about why you would ever take them off. I want you to listen to the silence and wonder if it is truly empty or if it is just waiting for you to make a mistake. The crazy mountains are still there, and they are still holding on to their secrets. We are just the investigators trying to make sense of a world that doesn't want to be understood. Stay on the trail and keep your friends close, and for God's sake, don't look back if you hear your name being called from the trees. Because the mountains are listening and they have all the time in the world.